Even 10 years ago, I'll tell you that when I first told my story, I was terrified talking about being different because there weren't openly queer, disabled people of color doing this, right? Like I felt completely alone. I was on an island and I thought, I'm never going to have a job. Like this is going to impact me forever. And now, 10 years later, things have really shifted. People are talking about issues of identity. And I hear this dialogue around representation. And I think that's what you're talking about is making sure people are seated at the table. But one of the things I think our discipline also needs to do is beyond representation, as you're saying, we need to have the resources to support people. It's not enough to say, come be therapists. We need to be able to actually support folks through school, give people a livable wage. Going through grad school and trying to afford grad school is a financial privilege because there are so many expenses, for example. And so I think we have a lot to do in order to make sure that if we're going to welcome people, people feel safe. And I think that's true for our clients too. They've seen the harm of mental health care and they need to be shown that it is safe to come here.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Hey, everybody. You may have heard Ann's story about her relationship so far with this new sponsor called Superpower. It's time now for me to share mine. It's really interesting. What they do is for this membership, which normally is $4.99 because it's looking at all of these biomarkers of health. Right now, there's a special for $1.99 that they will set up a lab. And by set up a lab, I mean it's like concierge service. It's boutique service. They walk you through it. They explain it. You get lots of choices through the whole process. They help you set up the appointment and they remind you when your labs are ready. You get the original labs back and then you get their report, which goes into incredible detail, way more than your regular labs at your regular doctor's office. They look at biomarkers related to longevity, heart health, thyroid health, immune regulation, hormone health, which I learned all kinds of things about my hormones that I didn't know, and have some new thoughts and a new plan about some of those things. So that was very helpful to me. Metabolic health, nutrients, of course, liver health in detail, kidney health, heavy metals and electrolytes, inflammation, and of course, then the typical blood test, which is what we normally get at the doctor's office. All those things, they're always available for you if you have questions. They'll set you up on a plan if needed. Then in 6 months, you get to do it again, and it gives you a way of checking how you're doing. And then in the meantime, there's lots of other services that they offer that would be entirely optional for you. But we're happy about the sponsor. Thank you, Superpower. When you go to superpower.com, let them know that TU sent you, Therapist Uncensored sent you, just as a way of supporting the show. But otherwise, go grab it now while it is only $1.99 to get 2 labs and the support in between. Thanks. So you know how there are episodes that you love more than others? Well, if I'm honest, there are interviews that really stand out for me as well. I absolutely loved my conversation with today's guest, and I honestly believe you will too. José Rosario is a mental health professional who identifies with multiple diverse identities and is generous in sharing his story and his inspiration. He developed cerebral palsy as a premature infant. And as you'll hear, he was shaped by the steadfast fight for equity that his very young Puerto Rican parents persistently engaged with. He's an interdisciplinary minority fellow for the American Psychological Association and has been honored with multiple awards for excellence in psychology, where his research focuses on cultural trauma in intersectional communities. He's also the founder of the Phoenix Empowered, which facilitates an inclusive mental health conversation in order to empower systematic change. More than that, he's just a lovely human, and we could really use these kinds of kind and smart conversations right now. It's my pleasure to bring you José Rosario. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Therapist Uncensored, and welcome José Rosario.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can we get started by you describing yourself?
Yeah, lately I've been really stepping into this identity as a storyteller. So I think I would call myself an empowered storyteller that wants to be out in the world telling stories and amplifying other stories.
Oh, that's beautiful. You call yourself an unconventional therapist. What makes you unconventional?
A few years ago, I was at the American Psychological Association, and something really struck me, and I felt very seen because I heard the president of APA at the time say, people have been healing long before therapists existed. And so I think what makes me unconventional is that I want the client to decide what it looks like to engage in healing, and we pull from different places, whether it be indigenous practices, indigenous ways of knowing, whether it be cultural practices and connecting with community. Like that to me is what matters, and I think our modalities work well, but can always be infused with some more awareness of systems and liberation and play. I've been really trying to incorporate some play into the work I do.
I've been specifically just love the idea of getting out of the stream of our educational, our monolithic education. But it's difficult to some degree to find, like even when I'm speaking with people with minoritized identities that want to do it, as far as like, what does that mean, indigenous healing? And how does that look in sessions? Do you have thoughts about that? Like how it actually shows up?
Yeah, the way I see it, or at least the way that I practice, is that it's augmented, right? So we are using, in my case specifically, I'm an ACT therapist. So I do a lot of work around values and how folks define the life they want to live. And in that, I can infuse, if part of that is wanting to connect with community, okay, so what are the nonprofits in your area? How do we connect to those nonprofits? What are the cultural practices that you want to hold on to? And maybe there are some that you want to let go of, but can we find that balance of where do you want to be right now? How do you want to situate? And then educating myself on the client in front of me and saying, what is their cultural practice? What is their tie to culture? Because even as a field, right, we don't have one definition of culture. It's so nuanced.
That's right. And, you've spoken about the idea that therapy can actually do more harm, especially related to being unaware of systems and then recreating the problem in session. Can you say more about that?
Absolutely. I think all of us, whether well-meaning or not, right, we can cause harm. I think when we make assumptions, we have to acknowledge that we're all meant to make assumptions, right? We all see things and want to categorize them. That's a psychological process. And so being able to slow down and check that and say, well, how much data do I have to support this? And what is the person in front of me telling me? I tell people all the time, if you could get off your iPhone and just like have a conversation, you'll learn a lot more about somebody just by listening. But I think we can cause harm, and I'm sure I've caused harm. I can think of a couple of instances where that's happened. And I can also think of times where harm was caused to me in the reverse, and sort of balancing that narrative too.
That's where I was just thinking of going, just to be able to bring more of your story in. As a client, how have you experienced it? I'm assuming you've been a client at some point. See, here's an assumption I'm making.
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
Behind every therapist is an even better therapist, right?
So I was thinking about that. And also, you've talked about your intersectional identities as a gift.
Yeah, you got it. I'm going to step out of the therapy room because I think the experiences out of the therapy room inform me as a person. I am a disabled man who uses a wheelchair. I grew up with parents who were young and Spanish speaking. And so we faced a lot of healthcare invalidation, right? When I tell my story, I tell people all the time about how my parents were always told, it's okay if you can't do this, right? It's okay if you can't take care of him, because they were young and didn't speak English and people made assumptions. And I think, assumptions have been a huge part of my own upbringing. When I was about 6 years old, a doctor flat out said to my parents with me in the room that I wasn't going to accomplish anything, right? Like there were these limitations set on me. And that's me actually making it a lot nicer than what was actually said. And so you can imagine that we make assumptions and we're harmed by assumptions. And I think I bring that with me as a therapist, always trying to be curious and respectful and really trying to let the client lead. Because had I let, for example, that doctor lead, I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in right now, and I'm very fortunate and privileged to be here.
Well, and this is Therapist Uncensored, so you do get to say anything that you want, whether it be what the doctor said or.
I appreciate that. She used a slur, so I'm gonna reference.
Not repeat the slur, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So, can you say a little bit more about your story? I think that this really informs kind of where we're going.
Yeah, yeah. So I was born premature, and my parents made the early decision that they were going to be what I would call activists. I'm not sure they would call it that, but they stood by me and said, "We're going to make this happen. We're going to provide our child with what he needs, and we're going to fight in the courts and fight in the medical system, and we're going to fight everything we need to fight in order to get him things like resources for a wheelchair, access to healthcare." And my parents were a big motivation for me. My mom, in particular, I say she's my best friend. And so she's been with me on this journey. And I think for a long time, I struggled with feeling different, right? I wasn't the kid that was running around or jumping on the trampoline. I was the kid in the wheelchair who liked to read and who liked to socialize and connect, but also liked to be alone. And for me, that experience of difference was really hard. And that I think is where my mental health started to be impacted by feeling like, oh, I don't belong in this world, right? The world is not built for my experience. And I'm very lucky that I found providers and friends and family who wrapped around me and supported me through that. And it led me to being a therapist. But I think, like many of us, I had the initial inkling of like, I want to help people. I have strong feelings about the word help, because it automatically says there's a power differential. Like, we know what the person needs. And so I see it more as like, let's accompany and figure out together what it is you want. And if you need a gentle nudge, I'll give you that gentle nudge.
It makes me think about even the idea of cure, that like it has that same thing, that there's something wrong that we need to fix.
Yeah. And how harmful that is, right? To be in such like a deficit model.
Mm-hmm. What do you think it was about your parents, as probably not educated in systems and not educated in, not supported necessarily in that way? What was special about them that they were able to listen to themselves and resist these very powerful pressures against what their heart or what their intuition told them to do?
Yeah. Talk about cultural phenomenon playing a role. It really is. It's a cultural piece of like, we are collective and we are strong together and we're going to fight. I think a lot, especially recently with the way that the world is these days, about where I come from. And I've been telling this story a lot lately about how my parents, my mom in particular, would tell me about the Taino indigenous tribe in Puerto Rico and the ways in which they would strap babies on their back and fight for the island in order to not be colonized. And I remember the day my mom said, those are the people we come from. And I think I like to draw on that strength. And I would say that my parents do too. They draw on the strength of our collective to say, we're not going to let anybody define who you're going to be. My mom still to this day tells me, you can't say that you can't do something until you try. And that's always been her motto throughout my entire life.
What a beautiful example of this cultural strength that when tapped into, it's not always tapped into, because I imagine that there's these effort to separate and to impose, which I think gets to some of what you're describing about using systems, liberation psychology would tap into the strengths of ancestors and history that's already there. Can you say more about that?
Absolutely. I ascribe to the radical healing framework, and I joke that the radical healing model found me, not that I found it. And as much as that's a joke, it's real. I was in the first couple years of grad school feeling pretty tired, feeling pretty unsure about whether or not the way I saw the world fit into this medical model. And then I read a paper on radical healing, and it talked about how while working with clients, we can encourage cultural authenticity and connecting to ancestral wisdom and figuring out where we find strength and where we have found strength throughout all of the generations and finding hope in the future based on that strength. And everything started to click for me, and I felt like, oh, these are the kind of people I sit with. And so I read as much as I could about radical healing, about liberation psych, about culture. And now for me, that's just a part of how I see the world. I come from the Taino indigenous tribe, but I also come from the civil rights activists, the queer activists, the disabled activists who were like, we're not going to stand for this. They are the people that have led the way for me. And I hope that in my lifetime, I can lead the way for the next wave of people. And that's what we're all here to do.
So you also have an organization, a nonprofit that you have started. Is that right?
Yeah. I went on a wild left turn my life went. I never thought this would be where I would be, but I'm excited. Yeah. So it's the Phoenix Empowered. It's a mental health nonprofit dedicated to amplifying the stories of minoritized communities. So talking about indigenous mental health, BIPOC mental health, disabled mental health, queer mental health, and really trying to amplify the lived experiences. But there's sort of the second arm here because I believe that when people tell us our stories, it's not enough to just say, oh, that's so sad. I'm so sorry you're going through that. We actually have to respond. I think as therapists, it's our duty to do something with the information that we're given to make the world a better place. And so I travel and do education and consultation about liberatory practices, about how to think about identity specific experiences of harm in the workplace or in a university setting to really support an inclusive mental health conversation.
So when you say empathy alone is not enough, that we need to work to dismantle the systems that are causing the harm. Can you give us some examples of that or where you point people to?
Again, a radical healing perspective. I can talk about radical healing all day. We talk a lot about the differences between coping and healing. So I'll talk to clients about how it's not enough to tell them, here are some coping skills to cope with systemic racism, for example, because the racism is still being perpetuated. Rather, as you're saying, dismantling the system to engage in healing. So encouraging the client to find a place where they can be authentically themselves, where they can find safety, where they can organize if they choose to organize, and finding ways to push back against the systemic racist institutions that they're a part of.
You know, there'll be a lot of therapists listening, a lot of well-meaning therapists that would consider themselves allies of the queer community or the, some of these different identities. But it's hard to see what we don't know. So just for specifically around ableism, because I've been thinking about that a lot, how is your traditional therapist unintentionally ableist?
Especially with our coping skills, right? So I've worked with clients who are neurodivergent in many different ways and needing to really attune to the fact that saying to clients, doing things like organizing a schedule, having structure, having routine, very, very helpful, but we might need to break it down a little bit smaller and we might need to make it more nuanced, I think is really important. But in terms of our interactions with each other, I will say there's ableism in the room, right? I can't tell you how many times I've had a client ask me if I was the therapist, right? When I roll in with the wheelchair, and that's part of what happens given the way that I'm visible. And COVID was an interesting example where everything went telehealth and suddenly that stopped, right? There were no questions about whether or not I was the therapist, whether or not I belonged in that space, but those messages were being sent.
Because they couldn't visually see the difference just with COVID. Is that what you mean because you're online?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the difference couldn't be seen. And I think in terms of our clients, I take that example and really apply it to this idea of like, what am I not seeing in the client, right? What is the client telling me? If they're telling me they're at capacity, maybe there's no point in pushing at this moment in time. If the client is saying, I'm at capacity right now, something is going on. The cognitive load has met its match. And so figuring out, okay, so how do we reduce the load instead of saying we're not coping enough? And I think that's the harm of the medical model, right? People feel like I'm not getting better, I'm not doing enough. And we unintentionally shame people.
Oh, I can think of somebody very specifically that the whole thing is, I'm still depressed. I know I should do more. I could do more. Why am I not doing more? And very intersection, with chronic illness and all of these things. But it's just culturally, it's, and as a matter of fact, therapy is set up that we're in a room alone and we're both looking at the person that is here to see us. So it almost like the structure of it creates this unintentional blame, if you will.
Absolutely. And a power differential.
A power differential. So that the therapist has to be very conscious about thinking about pulling out the wide lens. And, I think about, I do a lot of groups and like when to go systems, when to talk about systems. Can talking about systems be a defense? Can not talking about systems be a defense? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's so client specific, right? And so if a client says something like they're blaming themselves, here's an example. I worked with a client once who kept saying to me, Jose, no matter what, I keep applying to jobs that I know I'm qualified for, and my colleagues are applying to the same jobs, and they're getting interviews, and I'm not. And at this point, I just think I'm not good enough, right? And at that point, I did gently probe and say, well, do you think that there are some systemic concerns here. And the client kind of lit up and was like, are you asking me if they're being racist? And I'm like, well, I'm asking you if you're feeling like there are some barriers that are out of your control here. And that's where we were able to have that conversation around systems. But I can see the flip side of that, right? Where somebody is so attuned to the system that we're not thinking about what is in our control. So I think being able to navigate the conversation of where do you have power? Where can you rise up? And where do you need to kind of say, this is outside of my scope or outside of what I can do right now, is the litmus test for how much to lean into the systemic piece.
Mm-hmm. So focusing on what we can control, like these are ways that I think that you're saying that we can unintentionally perpetuate it, of focusing on what the client can do, and then at times being able to put, set the systems part aside and be able to look at the individual. Is that right?
Yeah, and being cautious or at least cognizant of where the person is putting blame. Because I think more often than not, my experience is that people put blame internally and don't often look at the system. So it's up to the therapist, right, to be skilled enough to say, could this be ableism? Could this be racism? Could this be, ethnocentrism? And I think we're not trained to do that, right? I don't remember a conversation in grad school, at least to date, talking about here's how you talk about systemic oppression. Rather, it's more just being curious and taking the step and asking the question. The worst that'll happen is the client says, no, I don't align with that idea. And okay, then you don't align. But
even then, you've opened the door and given the idea, and you don't kind of know where that'll go for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, because how many times do we blame ourselves for the harm that's being caused? And there's a really great radical healing article that talks about how self-blame is a lot of the pain and can really impede healing, right? It can keep us from healing when we think everything is our fault. And I lived there, right? I remember being that young kid who blamed himself and was like, I'm different, I'm not good enough. And needing to step out of that, needing to say, no, the world may not be built for you, but you're going to build your own world. Like you're going to figure out where you fit. And I think that's what I'm hoping clients will be able to do, to be empowered to say, no, I get to design my life the way that I see fit.
Well, it makes me think of, even for example, with the disability, advocacy, or particularly with neurodivergent advocacy, that a lot of times historically it's been the parents that have been advocating, but they're not, versus the actual person affected. So there's been an unconscious, assimilation and trying to get, social skill building and, things to make that they think is in the best interest of the child, but that the child isn't being represented. That's not what the child might want. And so I think, this idea of changing the world to fit the child instead of the child to fit the world is a little bit of what we're describing, and how we can do unintentional harm, thinking that we're being helpful.
Absolutely. And disability is a family systems experience, right? Everybody is impacted by that, whether it be through a caregiver role, whether it be through your own shifting of how you saw the world. Like everyone gets to kind of touch that experience, but the person living it is the one who needs to have the voice. And I recognize that maybe a child isn't ready, but we want to make sure that we're not perpetuating the narrative of stay silent and do what people tell you to do. Because I think I see that a lot, right? People not claiming a voice.
Yep. That's right. And then from an organizational standpoint, making sure that the people affected are the ones in charge. Again, there was an example of somebody creating a autistic choir. And I was asking, if you're creating this, who are the leaders that are developing the program? Do you have people representing in a leadership position versus this one that kind of power over, let's do this nice thing for people. And it's tough. One thing that helped me when I was thinking about, like, okay, I want to understand my own. In this case, it was about ableism. How am I? I'm thinking again. I'm trying to be well-meaning, but we were having a conference or something, and we were thinking about accessibility. And when I realized that, actually, the reason that I don't feel like I need any accessibility is because my needs have already been met. The temperature, water, chairs to make me comfortable. So then I don't realize that there's actually been a lot of physical things to take care of me that have already happened because that's considered the norm. And it's that same just natural care that we're being asked as far as, hey, check out your accessibility and things like that. Does that fit for you?
Yeah, actually, and sort of calling back to something you said earlier, it reminds me of the systemic oppression within our field, within our discipline, right? Even 10 years ago, I'll tell you that when I first told my story, I was terrified talking about being different because there weren't openly queer, disabled people of color doing this, right? Like I felt completely alone. I was on an island and I thought, I'm never going to have a job. Like this is going to impact me forever. And now, 10 years later, things have really shifted. People are talking about issues of identity. And I hear this dialogue around representation. And I think that's what you're talking about is making sure people are seated at the table. But one of the things I think our discipline also needs to do is beyond representation, as you're saying, we need to have the resources to support people. It's not enough to say, come be therapists. We need to be able to actually support folks through school, give people a livable wage. Going through grad school and trying to afford grad school is a financial privilege because there are so many expenses, for example. And so I think we have a lot to do in order to make sure that if we're going to welcome people, people feel safe. And I think that's true for our clients too. They've seen the harm of mental health care and they need to be shown that it is safe to come here.
Yeah, I totally agree. As a matter of fact, I think of when earlier when I was talking about this monolithic education, part of that is that you have to have letters behind your name. And to get those letters behind your name, it's very expensive. And it means that you'll be trained by a very narrow range of folks. So I like you kind of going all the way back to, we still want to support accessibility related to becoming a therapist, and that it's going to require some of those things that potentially, I wonder, like the unconscious, intentional pushing people out, like I think even psychoanalysis, it's only relatively recently that social workers could become psychoanalysts. It was physicians only, there was these hierarchies. And I think this is part of dismantling it is, first of all, even noticing it and being able to talk about it.
Absolutely. I mean, ableism is baked into our work, right? If we think about intelligence testing and the harm that has been done with intelligence testing, that's a side passion of mine to really try and think about how are we doing psychological testing in a way that is affirming and just and actually helpful and contextually relevant. And that comes from my experiences in grad school, reading articles about how people believe that people of color are inherently less intelligent and how harmful and frankly disgusting that is. Yeah, yeah.
Well, and each of our, the American Psychological Association, even this National Association of Social Workers have this baked into their histories.
Hey, what I love about this sponsor, Cure, is that I use it, I think, practically every day. Cure is a plant-based hydration drink. It doesn't have any sugar, artificial sweeteners, super refreshing, and it keeps me hydrated. So hydration goes really way beyond drinking water. And I fool myself. I carry tea and water with me all day long. So I think I'm getting enough of everything, and yet I'm really not. It's all about replenishing electrolytes. We lose it through sweat, sleep, workouts, margaritas. Water isn't enough. I'm not alone. 75% of Americans are dehydrated and don't drink enough water or electrolytes. It adds to fatigue, dry skin. So I don't like to drink the sports drinks that have a lot of sugar and artificial color. Cure's high standards, has Himalayan salt. It really tastes wonderful. My favorite is watermelon because it's not too sweet, but I love watermelon. For TU listeners, Cure is offering 20% off your first order. So stay hydrated and feel your best by visiting curehydration.com/TU and use the promo code TU at checkout. So that's curehydration.com/TU and use TU for 20% off your first order. Hey everyone, I have some great news to share. Our partner, AG1, just launched their next generation. So in the same single scoop, you now get more vitamins, minerals, and upgraded probiotics. And it's now backed by 4 human clinical trials. So, in fact, AG1's next generation is now one of the most clinically backed greens powder. They went above and beyond the industry standard in testing and have made a great product actually even better. We frequently speak on the podcast about how important gut health is to our moods, our overall energy. And it's so hard to know what to do about it. I hate taking pills, and finding the right regimen doesn't always sometimes seem like just daunting. But AG1 Next Generation is clinically shown to fill common nutrient gaps, even in healthy eaters, actually, and support gut health. So this helps me know that I'm doing something good for my health. I actually look forward to my afternoon drink. I still love the taste. It's a refreshing way to get my foundational nutritional supplements. So, subscribe today to try the next generation of AG1. If you use our link, you'll also get a free bottle of AG D3K2 and AG1 welcome kit, as well as 5 upgraded travel packs with your first order. So make sure to check out drinkag1.com/therapist uncensored to get started with AG1's next generation. And notice the benefits for yourself. That's drinkag1.com/therapist uncensored. When someone close to me got out of the hospital this past spring, she had all these specialists lined up, cardiologists, endocrinologists, you name it. But literally, she had no one to coordinate her care. So we're sitting there looking at the list of follow up appointments. And when I asked her about a PCP, she said she has kept meaning to find one, but she keeps running into these roadblocks. Either they don't take her insurance, weren't taking new patients. It was stressful because she really needed someone to coordinate her care. So we literally pulled out my phone right there in her living room and got on ZocDoc. Within 10 minutes, we found her a primary care doctor who takes her insurance, had great reviews, and could see her that same week. It was amazing. ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare high quality in network doctors and click to instantly book an appointment. You have access to over 100,000 doctors, anywhere from mental health to psychiatry. So you can find a psychiatrist with openings, to dentist, urgent care, every specialty. And in fact, once we booked her PCP, I realized how much I've been putting off going to see a dermatologist. So I jumped on and did that as well. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments. Go to ZocDoc.com/TU to find and instantly book a top rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/TU. ZocDoc.com/TU.
You're a scholar and you're an advocate, you're a therapist, but let's get nerdy.
Let's do it. Yeah.
What have you learned about hate motivated violence?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say the reason I went back to grad school, I originally thought I was going to be this like data scientist guy wearing suits and reading charts, and because I thought that was being a therapist, right? That's how I was trained. And I was miserable because we weren't thinking about things like culture and context. And I was working in a university setting and working with college students who I will stand on this hill. They are the coolest people in the entire planet. College students are the social engine of every country, every movement, and they taught me a lot. And one of the things I noticed were, as social media started to boom, people were really distraught, obviously so, by the danger and the harm happening. And when the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, that for me shifted a lot. It shifted my own experience because it was the first time that I was like, whoa, those are queer Latinx people. Those are my people. I'm terrified and sad and angry about this. But then seeing the ripples of that on a college campus, seeing students coming to my office because they knew I was queer and a person of color in the Disability Services Center, and being able to come in and talk about their experiences. And the same with police brutality, and things just kept coming and coming and coming. And I started to get bombarded with all of this stress and pressure and burnout, right, of being that person for folks. And I was really frustrated because I was like, well, what is it? It's not trauma, because by definition, the trauma needs to have happened to you, right? There needs to be an index event for it to be PTSD. What is this? So I started reading in the literature and getting really nerdy, and I found cultural trauma, the sociological theory of cultural trauma. And I was like, that's it. I'm going back to grad school to show how psychology can use cultural trauma. And so my research has all been about hate-based violence and how folks feel distressed from witnessing or reading about violence on social media or in the media, and looking at how folks engage in healing after being exposed to traumatic stimuli, right? Because we know, data has told us time and time again, that even just reading about violence, people can develop PTSD symptoms. And so trauma is so much more widespread than our diagnostic manual even considers. And so that's a lot of my work has been, when folks encounter violence, what is their level of distress? How distressed do they feel? Why are they feeling this way? And then how are they engaging in healing?
And what have you found? What have you learned?
Yeah, I've learned that people, as I think we know in pop culture, we see ourselves reflected, right? And that piece of being one of the folks impacted, even if you were not a direct victim, that community, that collectivity is important. It's important to know that people are a part of a community, even if they're light years away. I wasn't in Florida when the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, but that is my community. And I found that people really contextualize violence, right? Especially younger folks. They're not seeing a violent event as just what's happening in the present day. They're thinking about how this has happened for generations. And I hear a lot of people saying, my people have been targeted for years and years and years. And so there is this sort of historical awakening that I think the current day is really experiencing that makes this pain so much deeper. I've talked to folks who are in their 40s. I've talked to folks who are 18. I've talked to folks who are in their 70s. And we've talked about how every time something comes up on the news screen, it reminds them that we're not safe, or that people think we don't have the right to exist. And that's obviously painful. But we as therapists, I don't think, are trained to support folks. And my research is showing that because of that, folks aren't coming to therapy. They're actually going to community centers. They're going to nonprofits. They're wanting therapists to go and say to a nonprofit, how can you help? How can I develop a group for you that we can offer to your community? What's our plan if something happens in the community to make sure we have a response ready? And those are the kinds of things that I'm really thinking I'm going to focus on after this last chunk of my dissertation is complete, to really focus on community response. I want to be out in the community, getting my hands dirty, so to speak, and figuring out what's our community level responses when harm like this happens on a widespread level.
So powerful. I'm having an association as a white privileged person. I'm queer, but I can pass, things like that. So there's a way that I live in this very protected world. And we just had this huge storm in Texas. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people are missing still. And all of us that have been camping in those areas, and then the news is repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. And I was thinking about this as similar and different, that it's similar just in the sense of I'm identifying, I kind of get teary just thinking about it. Having children, having sent them to camp, having been a camp member, all of these things, this flood went through a camp, in case, people aren't understanding what I mean. But what's different about it is that it was a natural disaster. So I think that is very different than seeing police brutality, seeing even queer hate crime, legislation, questioning our right to our children, those kinds of things. So what are your thoughts about that?
You're right that it's different, but there are some cultural trauma scholars who would say that depending on the context of the natural disaster, it could be a cultural trauma. So if we think about Hurricane Katrina, for example, that was a cultural trauma for the Black and Brown community that very clearly did not have the resources that they deserved and that were rightfully theirs. And there have been some really great articles talking about how that experience in and of itself is a cultural trauma for the Black community. So I think natural disasters can be just as harmful as man-made disasters. I think the piece that I'm finding to be most salient, most poignant is there a systemic piece attached to this that reinforces the narrative, I don't deserve to exist, or I'm not safe? That's the dangerous piece. If we're telling people time and time again, I don't deserve to be here, I'm not safe here, that's damaging to anyone. Not to mention just sad. Loss of life is sad no matter what.
and just that kind of suddenness. And yeah, who knows what we'll end up coming to find out related to cuts, systemic cuts in warning systems, and, and even the recovery afterwards with FEMA and being able to rebuild, it has changed now. I'm out actually in Asheville right now, who also had just gone through the hurricane, and they were telling us that literally one day everyone was out working, and then funds got cut and people stopped helping in the same way. And so that's a system part of having the resources to support communities to rebuild themselves.
Absolutely. And it also frustrates me thinking about our model, right, of treatment, because when things like this happen, I think we're still living in a world where people kind of expect, well, they'll come to therapy if they want support, right? People will come find me. And I don't think that's how that works. I truly think in order to gain a community's trust, we need to be part of the relief efforts, right? We need to be out there saying, what do you need? Handing out water, handing out blankets. That is our job as healers in the community. And so I think that's how we engage in true healing work. That's what I would say, at least. And I'm committed to that in my own life, and I've made choices about getting involved as much as I possibly can, because it's important to me that people see that I'm not just sitting in my office being like, tell me about what's going on and let me, sort of support you in building a life. No, like, let's go out there and change what's happening right here, right now.
Yeah, well, not only, come to my office, but pay me a very high fee.
Right,
and,
right.
So there is stuff for us to reflect on for sure about that. So I'm thinking in terms of the different identities that you have, and you've called them a gift. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I look back at that little kid who was like, I'm so different. Nobody wants me around. Nobody wants to, date the guy in the wheelchair. Why do I also have to be queer on top of it? The whole narrative that I told myself anyway. I think now about how those experiences of difference, the experience of having to kind of find my voice, of having to navigate some pretty serious systemic harm, like I mentioned in healthcare, but also in academia, right? Like, these things happen, people say things. All of these moments, I think, have given me the opportunity to figure out how to navigate spaces that aren't built for me. And I think people with disabilities in particular, we're very reactive. We can see a space and understand, okay, this is what I need, and that has served me. I think I've learned to love my identities because I've had people in my life say, people need to hear this, right? Because I had people affirm me, I was able to love those parts of myself. And now, present day, these things are a gift because they allow me to connect with people. At every single level, somebody knows what it's like to feel different. That allows me to connect with the person sitting in front of me and allows me to do my job better. And so I think that use of self for me has been a big gift.
As you've struggled with your own self-acceptance and these messages about you, is there a sense that, and I know this might sound strange, I'm thinking about Eli Clare's book, The Cure, The Question of the Cure, something like that, who was talking about whether or not he would change these different aspects of himself. Would it be okay to kind of go there about like your own process of how you've come into relationship with these different parts?
Yeah, because that narrative has changed so much. I think when I was a kid, I probably would have said, absolutely, I would change anything about myself. I want to change these things. And as an adult who has done a lot of work and a lot of introspection, I don't want to be cured, right? People ask me all the time, would you want to walk? And I'm like, well, first of all, I walk with canes. So what an assumption you're making. But also, like, I don't need to be cured. This is a part of my life, and frankly, has made me strong and has made me kind. And honestly, it makes me connect with people more. And I'm so grateful, and I love the parts of myself that are different because they allow me to see the world in a way that doesn't perpetuate oppression. At least not always, right? Because we all make mistakes, but I'm more mindful because of lived experience.
This is so important. Such an important message. This idea of like in a sense, if we all live long enough, we're going to lose ability. We're all going to lose ability if we live long enough. And the idea that this is normal, whatever your current functioning is normal, and everything else is bad or what have you, is problematic because then, even as you do begin to lose functioning, there's so much shame about like, oh, I need help in a different way now. So that this message of no, like this is good. This makes you stronger. This helps you see the world in a different way. I think that message has literally I have a son who is suffering from long COVID that has turned into probably MES, I'm forgetting what it stands for, but chronic fatigue and potentially a lifelong debilitating change for him. And because he had studied some disability activists and things like that before he got sick, he was in debate, he's turned to that as a way of he's like, Mom, I could do more before, but I see the world differently now. Like his values have changed, what he finds comfort in, or what he, I don't know, just that it's like when your metronome changes. If you're going 60 miles an hour, the world looks this one way. And if you're going 20 or 30, you see more, you feel more. And he has helped me come to this idea of, instead of being so grief-ridden about his loss, he's only 26 years old, about the loss, it's more of like, okay, he's guiding me into this celebration even, and looking at my own speed and looking at my own processing, how fast I go and what I could benefit from slowing down and things like that. So this message, it's personally impacted me in such a positive way, but I just can imagine the listeners having this shift of like what's normal and what's healthy, and questioning that.
And each person gets to define how we make meaning, right? It's what a gift of humanity is that something really shitty or horrible can happen to us, and we can make meaning from it. It doesn't make it okay. It doesn't mean that the trauma was deserved or needed to happen, but it means that the person gets to move forward. And for me, my disability isn't a trauma, right? And I hear people say all the time as I enter my 30s, things like, oh, your body's hurting. And I'm like, well, first of all, my 30s have been nothing compared to the surgeries I had as a kid, right? And so this body has carried me through so much. I honored that body. Like, this body has served me in ways that people don't recognize because they see one version of me from the outside. And I think trusting the person to really claim their narrative, that's why the Phoenix Empowered exists, because I want people to tell their own stories. This is not, TPE has never been the Jose show. This is the opportunity for me to uplift the people that deserve to be uplifted, because when I was uplifted, my entire life changed. I was no longer that guy that wore suits and was serious and didn't think I could think about culture and context. I changed. I grew. Honestly, I call it unleashed, right? I became me. I got to learn who I was and got to start to experience who I wanted to be as a full person, not just this flat therapist. That's my goal here.
It's so, so exciting. Tell us more about the nonprofit, how to find it, and you have a podcast as well.
Yes, you can find us at The Phoenix Empowered on all platforms, and we do have a podcast, and I've been warning everybody that technically the podcast is coming back for a season 2, but it really is a new podcast because I had come into this podcast being somehow reverting back to my academic and very serious and very educated and data-driven person, and it was so boring. So in season 2, we have changed. It's more fun, more playful. I'm in a season of play right now. So that's called The Phoenix Unbound, and will be out in just a couple of weeks. By the time this is out, it should be out. So please come check us out.
I so can relate to the nerdiness.
Yeah.
My partner, who I co-lead this with, Ann Kelly, we both do it, but if she has something that she wants to learn about or talk about, I'm like, okay, you can't write a dissertation. Just nobody wants to hear your dissertation.
Yeah. And
then she'll do the same thing to me about like, okay, you're getting way too intellectual, and it's funny.
And it's a defense mechanism, right?
Oh, totally.
Therapists are great at intellectualizing, and we have to come back. These are lived experiences.
Well, that goes back to storytelling, which anybody can relate to a story. And I really, really love that. Another example, just really quickly, that I'm doing some work with is, have you heard of the Friendship Bench from Zimbabwe?
Yes.
Yeah, the grandmothers that are healing. And it's so community-based, and it is so, great research on it. And it's applicable. It's all community-driven. In every community, it looks different. So it's just sort of feels like simpatico. Similar.
Yeah, simpatico.
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you.
I got you. Yeah. Yeah, and that is a great call to action. And I don't mean to usurp here a little bit, but for those of you who are listening, I think that's our call here is to figure out how else can I be involved in my community? Knowing that we're all tired, knowing that therapists are often overburdened and overworked, what is feasible? How can I connect? Because the secret here is by getting involved in our communities, what I have found for me is that it recharges me, right? It reminds me why we do the work that we do, to see it in action. And so I'm hopeful that anyone listening, you can have an impact in your community, and I hope you can find it, no matter how small.
Well, I like what you're saying too about in your community, because it can be overwhelming to look at the national, what's happening, and that can really shut people down. But if you go small and look at, in your neighborhood or in your city or in your village, depending on where you're listening from, like what is a way for you to do a little more to go from passive to active, to do the thing that you kind of always thought you needed to do, but you haven't done yet, those kinds of things.
Yeah, promoting healing versus coping.
And Phoenix Empowerment, am I saying that right?
Phoenix Empowered.
Phoenix Empowered. What does that mean?
The name's very intentional. Thank you for asking. That was my way of frankly kind of giving the middle finger a little bit to the system, because there is this narrative, right, that we have to pick ourselves up by the bootstraps and rise up from the ashes. And I love that narrative. I do think people can rise. But I think the secret here is people have to be empowered to do so. We have to tell people that they can rise. We have to create the process for them to rise. And so the people in my life who said, you have a story, we're not going to let you, you're going to tell this story. Like, those were the people that saw something in me that I certainly did not see in myself. I would not have thought 10 years ago we'd be here. And so, this, to me, Phoenix Empowered is about empowering people to rise up and make change.
So if they went to your website, what, is this a good place to tap in and to begin to do this journey?
Yeah, we do have a newsletter that's being re-rolled out, but my contact information is on there, connect@thephoenixempowered.org. We have a blog that people can contribute to. Our podcast will be up there, and we have a lot of other fun things we're working on too. So more to come for sure.
I love the emphasis on play, because that's also sort of anti-systems.
And anti our training. I think I had to figure out what it meant to be playful and what it meant to have joy. I had a colleague once say to me, the cure for burnout isn't rest, it's play. You can rest all you want, you're still going to be burned out. You need to play. And she was right. And it stuck with me years later.
Oh, that's great. That's very empowering. So anything else, so let's both imagine listeners all over the world, they're tuning in, they're still with us, so they like what we're saying. Any other message you want to give them directly?
It's okay that you're also experiencing pain for what's happening in the world right now. I think we are not immune to the pain of the world. We are human. And right now it's a humanitarian crisis, and we are at the front lines of this. And if you are in pain, please know that there are people out there doing work and making change and who are fighting a fight alongside you. And more, we're connecting with each other. We're finding each other. This podcast is a space for us to find each other. And I'm grateful it exists, truly, because we need to know that it's all right to need a break every now and again. And there are people who are going to pick up the slack. You're doing enough.
I love that. I think that was a perfect thing to say. I felt it as you said it. I was like, ah.
Yeah, it's heavy. Yeah,
it's heavy. And yet we're not alone. It goes back to community, that we're all kind of the team that is all pulling in the same direction. And it's beautiful. All right. Well, anything else? You've got the mic. Anything that you want to say, whether we've mentioned it or not?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say that I represent one experience, and there's so many intersectional experiences, and I recognize that I'm very lucky to be able to talk about being who I am. And in the face of all the things that are happening in the world, that's not going to stop. I'm going to continue to do this work, and I'm so excited that if you're listening, you're also doing this work, and we're going to keep doing it together. And just thank you, truly, for creating this space. We need a space to be uncensored, to be authentic, to be real. it's necessary in our
Yeah,
line
to
of
be
work.
reflective of how we're part of the problem, but at the same time supportive and community. And I like what you said. If you're listening, you are part of this. If you're listening, you're part of our community. And I really encourage you, if you found value in this podcast, to share it with someone else that could be inspired in this way. This is good news. This is positive. These messages are so heartwarming and effective. Like, this is actual real change. And then also to go on wherever you get your podcast and rate us. That would be really helpful because that helps other people find it. Rate and review. Those are always very, very useful. And then in the meantime, can you say your socials one more time so that people can really be clear?
Yeah, absolutely. Please come find us. We're at The Phoenix Empowered on all platforms. And come hang out with us. Come chat. Tell us what you want to see. We're trying to play on social media. I'm not very social media savvy, but we're getting there. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not either, for sure. We're very fortunate. I don't know how we've survived all these years without knowing how to really do that. But okay, thank you, José Rosario. It has been a pleasure to speak with you, a delight to speak with you. And thank you all for listening. We will see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.